I mean, as is always the case, Ms. Grover presents us with a very vivid picture of what the on-the-ground reality for human rights defenders is today in India, right? Undoubtedly, the case of the Bhima Koregaon accused will go down in Indian history as one of the most serious and abrasive attacks on the human rights defender community in the country. And unfortunately, as her comments demonstrate, this won't be the last one. It seems like there will be more coming up, and the same pattern will likely be used. But what I wanted to do, since we have such eminent sort of practitioners who actually have practiced the Supreme Court, whereas I'm coming at it from more of an academic lens as a human rights advocate myself, but also as a professor of law, my comments are going to focus less on a particular case relating to the prisoners of conscience, and I'm going to focus more on the infrastructure of oppression that leads a human rights defender to become a prisoner of conscience, right? It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And one might think that the issues relating to prisoners of conscience merely deal with the criminal justice system, but that actually is not the full picture. There are many parts to this infrastructure, but let's focus on three for today. Let's focus on the social apparatus, the digital apparatus, and then finally the legal apparatus, which is what Ms. Grover was talking about as well. Starting with the social apparatus used to punish human rights defenders fighting for a fair and just future for the country, whenever someone speaks against the current ruling administration, they are likely to face social pressure to quiet them and attack their dignity in a very public format. When it comes to human rights defenders working in the Muslim community, they will be called terrorists. When it comes to defenders working to assist workers or students, they will be called drug dealers or drug takers. And when it comes to people working on gender issues, they will be called prostitutes or members of the sex industry, or other terms that are meant to demean and destroy the dignity of those human rights defenders, right? And I think that's the social pressure that's put on. And how does this happen? It can happen through the police and politicians making press conferences and public statements to malign the character and credibility of human rights activists, most often with false allegations. And as is often the case with false allegations, as long as they're sensational enough, some media groups will run the story and spread it throughout the country. This means, as a human rights defender, one has to be willing to allow their family's reputation to be dragged through the mud, which can in some cases lead to an estrangement from the family, right? And this means that when a human rights defender goes into prison, they are not going to have the same social support as they might have otherwise had without the social apparatus working, right? And if you think that prison is bad or it's very tough to deal with, imagine prison without having any family support, without having any of that background community sort of support that you need to get through that very tough period in your life. That's unbearable, right? And that's part of this process. And as Ms. Grover said, the punishment is the process itself, right? And if that's the case, then in addition to just being put in jail and being taken away from your family, there's also an attempt to try and malign the character of that person and their family to maybe create more estrangement between them. Oftentimes we see very brave families supporting the human rights activists that are part of their families and standing by them. But oftentimes there's a lot of pressure put on those families to cut off ties from that person. And that leaves them even more lonely, even more depressed, even more subject to this kind of mental punishment that's happening through their imprisonment. So let's move on. As I said, we're going to go through three. Let's move on to the digital apparatus that helps create the prisoners of conscience. Without a doubt, the revelations about the NSO hacking of human rights defenders around the world should be a wake-up call to anyone advocating for freedom or democracy in the world. In some instances, the unauthorized and illegal monitoring of phone is used to collect sensitive private information that can then be used to blackmail or publicly malign the character of human rights defenders, as I mentioned before with the social pressure. However, the problem in India is that the buck doesn't stop there. As has been found in the Bhima Koregaon case, malicious actors are not only surveilling the defenders' digital devices, but they're implanting false information on those devices. Once that malicious and inauthentic material is placed on the phone or computer of the human rights defender, the police and prosecution then rely on that fake material to prosecute individuals for crimes as serious as terrorism or sedition. Now we can finally get to, and this is a very, by the way, I violated the principles of being a lawyer and just talking about the law, because I want to talk about the social, I want to talk about the digital, because we need to be holistic in the way we're looking at this confrontation with the state. Finally, let's get back to the law, so I can at least earn my keep as an adjunct professor, right? The prisoner of conscience infrastructure is really based on the law and the criminal prosecution. And first, one has to remember that for prisoners of conscience, the process is a punishment, exactly what Ms. Grover said. So by using British colonial era laws concerning terrorism or sedition, the state can hold a prisoner of conscience for months, and in fact, even years before starting in earnest with the trial. That is not what the process is supposed to do. The process is supposed to be speedy. It's supposed to provide justice to both the victims and to the individual who's accused of the crime. It's not supposed to be used as a battering ram, right, to try and stop those individuals from engaging in the work that they're doing. But this is what we're seeing. We're seeing these older era laws being now used and modernized. And so again, this violates international law. It violates norms in Indian constitutional law relating to due process and speedy trial. And laws that are meant to combat terrorism in the country are now being weaponized against human rights defenders with the sole aim of silencing them through intimidation. And the prisoner is not the only target. And Govind, I would really emphasize this. In a prisoner of conscience case, we oftentimes focus on the prisoner. Here, it's not just the prisoner that's the target. The government is creating a chilling factor for anyone, any young person, any student, that they don't engage in this human rights advocacy, that they don't test the government on what they're saying, that they don't criticize them in a public matter, lest they be subject to the same Orwellian injustice system, right? And I wouldn't call it a justice system. Now it's become controverted into an injustice system, and a very systematic thing at that, as I've explained, with the digital apparatus, the social apparatus, and the legal apparatus. So this isn't just some random happenstance thing the government is doing, right? This is a very systematic view on how to structurally diminish and demolish, really diminish and demolish the ability of the human rights community to hold the government to account. So one has to understand that there's this entire infrastructure in place to silence these advocates in the country and turn them into prisoners of conscience. There are those social, digital, and legal systems working together to punish.
One more minute.
I'm not even going to take the minute. That's how I'm going to end it, Grover. Govind. There are social, digital, and legal systems in place for people that do speak out. And for people that could speak out, all of this is an intimidation factor, right? So we're not just addressing, because oftentimes when we think about prisoners of conscience, we think about those people who are in jail. And that's absolutely some of the people that we're absolutely concerned about. What I'm also concerned about, what I believe all of the people, the speakers in this room are also concerned about, is what about the 18 or 19-year-old young student who wants to go out in the street and protest? But now they have to deal with seeing these kinds of news stories, maligning people who are senior advocates in the field. They have to see the digital tools being used to repress those individuals. And then finally, they have to see those people put in handcuffs and taken by national security officers into prisons accused of terrorism or sedition. This is what they're seeing. So really, the calculation for them is going to be much more different. And then the future of human rights in India and the future of the advocacy of human rights in India is going to be at stake. So it's not always just about the prisoner of conscience. It's about the rest of the country being put in a prison as well. So that's where I'll end my note, Govind, and I'll pass it back to you.